Welcome to the Grid Mod Pod, brought to you by AEIC. In this podcast, you'll hear from the utility industry's top operations leaders on how their companies are working to modernize and improve our ever-evolving power grid. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome to the AEIC Grid Mod Pod, the go-to podcast for insights into energy grid modernization. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Cook, and I'm thrilled to have Cameron Brooks, the Executive Director of Think Microgrid, with us today. Cameron is a pioneer in the field of microgrids and really all things DER. In this episode, we're going to explore some of the most pressing topics that we all get to grapple with in this new energy economy. So let's get started. And Cameron, thank you so much for joining us today. I wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of introduce yourself to the audience and really what you've been working on. And we'll jump into this delightful conversation.
Great. Well, thank you. Yeah, it's wonderful to be here, Elizabeth, and I really appreciate the opportunity. So maybe I can just share a little bit. So I am the Executive Director of Think Microgrid. Think Microgrid is a coalition that's been around about 2.5 years now and was really founded to provide a unified voice for the broad microgrid industry, and to be able to speak about the different kinds of microgrids, the different configurations they come in, kinds of values and benefits that they bring, and then also to begin to have an understanding of the different policy issues that go along with that and that are associated with different kinds of microgrid. So we spend a lot of time just trying to help policymakers, decision makers at all level, the media and other stakeholders just understand what are microgrids and what do they hold for us in the future.
Yeah, and I'll just give a little bit of background from the utility perspective. What's happening is not everything's always about the technology or the operation thereof of the grid. We as a society love to use words and create ideas from a combination of words. So when we talk about microgrids, we currently have built the largest machines in the world that are a conglomerate of high voltage equipment that spans across very large, massive land. So one would call that a macrogrid, one could say. And so microgrids come in all different forms. And that's kind of where the rubber meets the road. And I think from a utilities perspective, depending on where you are in your regulatory environment, what rules and capabilities and technologies you currently have, really kind of make the question fun for us utility folk to really define what is a microgrid. And I'll just say from my personal experience, being a part of the utility industry and being able to benchmark with each other, we ask that question to each other quite often. And so a microgrid could be very different depending on your regulatory environment as well as your business model. Are you vertically integrated? Do you just own the distribution? There's all different combinations. So first off, Cameron, I'm going to maybe throw a softball or maybe not. Could you help our listeners understand what exactly is a microgrid from the perspective of ThinkGrid and the work you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more about the beginning observation about just the importance of words, especially in the policy realm, because, we put a lot of time and attention into new legislation, new rules, decisions that come out. And I think we often underestimate the impact that those words have on our physical landscape and the infrastructure. So combining the two is really important. So having said that, we look and see kind of three fundamental characteristics of a microgrid. And that's that it's intelligent, it's interactive, and it's independent. And so what that means, the challenge or a challenge is that microgrids can come in kind of all shapes and sizes. But those three characteristics are really important. So when I talk about intelligence, that usually means a bundle of distributed energy resources that can be connected together with some kind of controlling system and intelligence. The interactive part is important because that means that it's connected to the grid. And so it can be interactive, it can be flexible, whether that means, ramping up or ramping down demand or turning on or off certain devices within the system that is the microgrid itself. If it's not interconnected, and there's a lot of those, whether they're on islands or, many Alaskan communities that are almost fully independent, we might term those mini grids. So subtle difference, I suppose, between a microgrid and a mini grid. But that interactive piece is very important. And then finally, the independence. So the ability to island. So, for us, this then brings two really important operating profiles, meaning that a microgrid can operate and provide a lot of resilience during black sky events, but also during blue sky days and normal operating conditions. That kind of flexibility and intelligence can be very, very useful. And that's an important part. And so, a microgrid in our context, then it could be a home with a battery that's able to disconnect and operate and ride through certain disruptions. It can be a campus, whether it's a military base or hospital campus or university campus, that can be fully operational on its own at a much larger scale. And it's distinguished, I would say, from sort of its cousins of backup power. So backup power obviously can operate independently and is designed to do that, but it's really only designed to do that. So you don't get that interactive component. You just get that independence and resilience. And then, from a virtual power plant, where you get a lot of flexibility and a lot of interaction, but at being virtual, it can't actually provide the direct resilience at the customer level that we think distinguishes microgrids from those other cousins. But as you kind of call out, it's all part of a much larger family of distributed energy resources, newer technologies that provide a lot of flexibility and independence. So that's our definition of a microgrid.
And as you can tell, it is layered and complicated with everything grid. And I feel like for our listeners, a general idea is like when discussing these very technical topics, it tends to disengage all audiences. And therefore, as beings, if we don't understand, we don't like it. So one of the goals I think of this podcast is really how can we boil it down to some simple thoughts to kind of show that there is a path towards this realization of embracing new technology, new ways of using energy. No matter what that reason is, we can't deny the fact that having new ways to create energy creates new opportunity for a workforce, creative, ability to connect buildings, all of it is there. And what really we have been doing over the last 100 years as the grid that we have now evolves. So I guess I just want to ground us. When you said a house could have a battery and it has solar, when this all started, this being the ability to create energy that lights up our lives, it was a generator was designed to be in the basement, and you would bring a fuel source to that to light up a building. And so we can't forget that what happened was people had ideas that created opportunity to build out more and more of these assets to make it scalable to us beings. So I'm a history buff, and I just have to say, this is history repeating itself. We're going back to the realities, what if the ability to have our energy is more efficient or economical to smaller pockets of the population, and then we connect that from the bottoms up. And that's kind of the transformation that's occurred. So it's a very nerdy space to be, but I think if people understand, we are coming from a place we've been sitting before. It's just using new innovation, new ways of thinking, and that we should embrace it instead of thinking of it as scary. So I'll just discuss it from that broader picture, what opportunities and challenges have you seen in your pockets of engagement with the industry in this transition to clean, which I like to just say, new ways of producing energy, really particularly impacting the microgrids and the distribution system that you're connecting to?
Yeah, I mean, it's good, and I think super valuable to go back and kind of look at the history and understand that. And I think you're absolutely right. We sort of started at a much smaller scale in the industry, although, then somewhere around the turn of the century and early in turn of the last century, I suppose, it became clear that there were a lot of economies of scale that made a centralized model just much more efficient economically, physically, to be able to deliver power. It's funny, I think a little bit about when I took photography class in high school, and our teacher talked about the history of photography and how, ultimately all of photography up to that point had been some version of a chemical reacting to light and then being captured on a plate or a film or something. And he kind of offhandedly said, but all that's about to change because of digital technology. And this is kind of in the early 80s. And so, your future is going to look very different. And I feel like there's a parallel here right now where we have grown with this system that architecturally is mostly centralized with large resources and with flows of information and flows of energy that are mostly one way. But actually now we have this new capability that's coming up because of distributed energy resources that I think are going to just fundamentally change the architecture of the grid and allow it to really be both transformational at those bulk power levels, where I think a lot of the clean energy transformation has really been happening over the last couple of years, but now also kind of growing from the bottom up. I hesitate to predict exactly what that's going to look like, but it seems pretty clear that it's going to have a big impact on just the fundamental architecture. And that raises a bunch of different policy questions. It raises questions about capital investing and what is most valuable. And I'll say from our point of view and from Think Microgrid's point of view, it's clear that right now there's a lot happening. It's almost a tale of two grids. It's the best of grids and the worst of grids. There's a lot of opportunity from where microgrids are showing the value they have for resilience in critical facilities, for integrating in renewables, for powering new kinds of electrification like electric vehicles. And there's a lot of challenges because there's a bunch of policies and legacy operating protocols that might not be compatible with sort of the new opportunities. And so I think coming at that with a thoughtful approach, what's pragmatic, what makes sense, which of these policies should we revisit and think, is this how we want to carry this forward into the next century? So I'm hopeful that, like my photography teacher predicted, that we are actually at a place where things are just going to fundamentally change in ways that we're going to look back and think, of course, that was inevitable and it was highly beneficial. But right now it might feel a little murky.
I was going to, for the listeners, describe distributed energy resources, which you just did in that answer. So, and there's a whole series, season 1, but it's almost everything's happening at once. We have an infrastructure that was architectured for a certain flow that is aging, as we all do. And on top of that, not only do we have 1 or 2 new ways of producing energy, we have many. So we're talking about, when we say distributed energy resources, the dynamic change in solar, the amount of solar that's being installed just in the last 3 to 5 years is, look it up, it's crazy. So for anyone saying it's not happening, it's happening. But all that is a new energy source at the edge of the grid. And then you have your battery energy storage following the same kind of path. Then you have your vehicles that you mentioned. So now that's a whole episode in itself. And then you have the technology to talk to it all. So like you said, intelligence, like it has to be intelligent. I thought a fun thing I read, or it was actually, one of my peers, what quantifies a smart grid is just that it can communicate. And so if you think about that, we created a communication grid or connections. At the same time, we were creating an electric grid. But to make it smart, it's just that it's talking to each other. So now we're getting into the intelligence of many devices talking to each other. So what a microgrid is a combination of all of those devices with a purpose designed, right? And I guess just to wrap up the growth of what we're seeing, and you just stated, right, like the teacher in the 80s saying digital was coming. I think we can all sit back and realize we never thought we needed an iPhone until now we all have these smartphones, right? So I think we all can sit in a space with various technologies that rolled out just in our little, existence on Earth, that it went from we'll never need that to now everyone has it. I guess I think I picked up on, with Think Microgrid, there's a collaboration going on. And what you're effectively doing is creating a scorecard. So I want to give you an opportunity of what is this scorecard that you guys are developing, and how are you taking that into the industry and effectively moving it through?
So we have put together a scorecard. We released it back in November, and actually the scorecard and the methodology that it's built upon really came out of workshops that we've done at policy summits that we've hosted, at industry conferences, at meetings and workshops that we've hosted at regulatory events, like with NARUC commissioners, coming and kind of helping us think through, what are the criteria that we all think go into a good, valuable kind of microgrid environment. And so how can we judge whether a state is living up to its own potential or not? And be provocative enough to kind of break out of sort of not allow the past to tyrannize the future, so that we're just not locked into the same thing. So from that point of view, and I'll talk a little bit about how we've set up the scorecard, but we take as kind of a defining vision what the DOE has put forward for their microgrid program. So they're designing all of their activities around a vision that says, by the year 2035, which is just over a decade away, 30 to 50% of our generation needs are going to come from the distribution side of the electric grid, from the edge. Now, that's obviously a wildly different scenario than we have today. And I think some people hear that number and just think, well, that's fanciful thinking. I don't. I think it's entirely plausible, realistic with the technology we have on the shelf today. But 30 to 50% is a lot, and they see within that the building block being intelligent microgrids. And so we've looked across at 5 different kind of categories, and to some degree, I'll say we didn't grade on a curve. So no state got an A in our microgrid scorecard that we just put out. And the reason for that is, there's several reasons for that, but one of the most fundamental is, we are nowhere close to that 30 to 50% goal. Most states are well below 0.1% as we begin to look at, and we worked with Wood Mackenzie as a research partner to kind of quantify what does the fleet of microgrids look like in each state and what's the real capacity. So it's pretty easy to say, well, until you get, let's say, over 10% is the threshold that we used, you can't score an A there. But we looked at deployment, so that's one category. We looked at proactive policy, so taking some of these bigger policy questions and seeing whether there's activity there to try to reform those, update those. We looked at resilience and whether the state had a defined resilience plan that microgrids were a part of. We've looked at market access. So that's wholesale market access, but it also means distribution level markets for things like grid services. And again, there it's kind of easy to not give any state an A because those distribution markets don't exist. And even in the couple of states that have stepped forward to create microgrid tariffs, thinking about Hawaii and California, there's actually no microgrids that have been developed under those tariffs. So again, it's a little hard to see. There's a disconnect there, I guess I would say. And then the 5th category that we looked at is equity and whether or not there's some kind of explicit equity goal, especially thinking about those communities that have either been ignored or, have faced disadvantages along the way. So everyone can go take a look at our scorecard. As I say, no state got an A. We also didn't give any state an F, which we defined to be being obstructionist or sort of actively regressive in policies. But we did give out a lot of C's and D's. We gave D's to those states where we just couldn't find any real significant activity. We gave C's to a lot of states where there might be activity, but it didn't seem like there was any real coherent plan. And then we gave out a few B's where we thought, it seems like there's kind of a coherent plan and they're trying to work towards a roadmap of sorts, and there's a promising start. So we hope that it both is a way of measuring kind of where we are right now and, what is the state, but also to offer a bit of a roadmap to say, what are some of the things that we'd like to see states doing? And what are some of these questions we'd like to see states raising to be able to think about how microgrids can play a much bigger role in the future? And I guess the last thing I'll just say about that is, we are a big tent organization. We love all of our microgrid children. We think that they all have a role to play. And so it's not that we're trying to prescriptively push forward a certain agenda or a certain regulatory model. So I'd say the hard decisions to be made about whether certain policies should be updated or how they should be updated, That's the job, the unenviable job, I guess I would say, of regulators and policymakers and legislators, in each of those states. So while we're not necessarily invested in exactly what the answer is, we're very much invested in raising the questions and being provocative about what could the future really hold. And so, there's plenty of examples of that we touch on in the report, but that's kind of a general sense of the report, what we're hoping to do with it, and hopefully how it's going to offer a roadmap for those states that want to move forward more deliberately.
Yeah, so I feel like, being in the industry for 20 years, and when I reflect on when I learned the lessons or had that aha moment or understood why things may be playing out the way they are, especially from a technical operational perspective, it's not very easy to navigate. So I guess you said a lot of things, and I just want to kind of stay, like you said, NARUC, which you think in the world that we live in, everyone knows who NARUC is, but really it's a conglomerate of the commissioners who sit within all of the states to support and regulate the utility commissioners. And it's a group of people that come together and effectively discuss, what's working, what's not working, what can we do, how can we move things forward. And that group was created, if you think about it, and I like to think, how does things occur? It's always from an idea, right? And an idea was generated based on a need or an aha moment. And so when we think about the regulatory environment, it was something that was constructed, and my friends make fun of me because I bring him up in almost every icebreaker cocktail party, is Sam Insull. He's like a fascinating historical figure that literally has set the path to the grids that we have today. But he ultimately went to Chicago, built one of the largest grids ever, and at the time went to the state and said, listen, if you allow me to invest and build infrastructure to serve all, I will allow you, the state, the governing body, to regulate and ensure that we do it safe, affordably, and reliably, and keep the cost within means. We've been following that structure for over 100 years, which is fascinating. So when you're talking about, Think Microgrid, is why it becomes so complex is the who is allowed to build, how are they to build, what is the value of said microgrid in the particular part of said particular grid. It gets, right? So that's why it's a very large body of work that you put together, is to kind of provide some insight to each individual state, which is very the regulations are different across 50. So the rules and the tariffs and everything that happens within is different. So what you went out to do was to create a baseline for particular conversations in particular states to help enable this said technology to create the value. And so I think you said the word resiliency. Safe, affordable, reliable grids is what we, the utility space, has known. But this new idea of resiliency continues to come up in our discussion, and we as an industry have yet to define true metrics that can be holding across all entities. But it's the idea is once the grid does go down, based on all extreme weathers and everything that's outside of our control, how quickly can the grid come back to serve all? And so that's like a key component of the effectiveness of a microgrid is, we've built this really large grid. How can we break it down into smaller parts so it is enabled to come back on and be available, sooner than later? So I just felt like, just from your perspective, is like, the amount of work is to help drive these discussions to kind of clear the way to give this very viable opportunity to our customers to have more resilient as well as reliable, affordable, and safe. Okay.
Yeah.
So coming back, really, for your perspective and the conversations, balancing our customer needs with all of these emerging technologies that come together as a microgrid, kind of shifting a gear, which I like to say, anytime we're talking about enhancing, enabling, creating better value for the grid to function technically is for the customer. But you got to say it for people to get it, right? So what kind of growth are you seeing in terms of the customer, the voice, right? Speaking to this idea or this desire of wanting this type of technology?
Right. Well, let me back up for 1 second and to get to an answer to your question. So, I mean, bringing up Sam Insel is, of course, it's really valuable, but I would offer that one of the challenges that he was really trying to solve is really rooted in this concept of what is a natural monopoly and what are the conditions where the economies of scale of building a centralized resource, a really large investment in a centralized resource, just make it so that the social outcome is poorer if you've got two players in that. But there's also, now fast forwarding 100 years, to go from what I think of as economies of scale to economies at scale, which is sort of the natural progression of a lot of technology innovation, which is we expect the footprint of the natural monopoly to actually contract as technology gets better. And that's what we're seeing right now with distributed energy. So the ability that did not exist in Samuel Insull's day to have battery storage at your home, to have solar panels on your roof that could produce power, store it there locally, be able to politely and quickly disconnect from the grid when needed, re-engage with the grid as the conditions allow. Those were just capabilities that didn't exist at the time. And so there are assumptions that come out of the truth of having those economies of scale make sense in Samuel Insull's day. It might not still be relevant. And so those are some of the questions. So, places where we're seeing a lot of innovation, a lot happening in the commercial industrial space, a lot happening at the residential level, where people want to be, you talk about resilience, and fundamentally, yes, it's about how quickly the grid can get back up and running. But from the customer perspective, they may not need to know that the grid ever went down or that there was anything that ever happened if they've got a battery system at their house that allows them to ride through. Now, the technology doesn't allow that to be something where, right now it makes sense to, disconnect completely. And I think there's a lot of value in the network. Being interactive is part of our fundamental view of what a microgrid should be. But there are some policy barriers that I think it's maybe time to question whether or not those are still valid. And let's take the battery as an example. And I'm hardly the first one to bring this up. But whether it's an individual home or whether it's a grocery store that has built a microgrid to protect their inventory, there are neighbors right near that who probably could benefit from being able to have access. It probably, in most cases, makes sense to have one storage facility that's shared between 4 or 5 customers, let's say. But right now, the rules don't really allow that to be something that customers can invest in directly. And I think that's there's a valid question there of whether those rules are still serving us or whether they're actually getting in the way of being able to build communities that are independent, that can operate seamlessly in parallel with the grid, to complement and offer curtailment services as needed. And so these are some of the things that we're trying to call some attention to. But, back to your question of where are we seeing opportunity? It seems clear to me that the distributed energy technologies, they're here today. They can do a lot. They're only going to get better. One other thing I guess I will say, and then I'll maybe close out this thought. The electric grid over the last 100 years has really been designed where we are chasing peak because we know the physics of the grid demand that demand and supply be balanced. I wonder whether storage at all levels is going to fundamentally change that. And if you'll accept the analogy, there was a moment in history where salt was one of the most valuable commodities in the world. Roman soldiers were paid in salt. Wars were fought over salt because we needed that to preserve. Sorry?
We just talked about salt with my dad the other night.
Well, and now we think of it, what a ludicrous idea that is. In today's world, salt is everywhere. We have as much as we need, and we don't need that preservative value that it offered because it's available. I wonder whether, or maybe I hope for the day when we're going to look back and think, peak is the new salt. Will storage take away the demand that we have to always be chasing peak, because if a home can disconnect, if a microgrid can disconnect, if an entire community can disconnect when things are getting a little out of balance, and they can be self-organizing and they can be in communication, then we're really building a community of interactive resources that are working together. And peak is not the relevant goal anymore. It's not the relevant metric. That's what I hope for.
And I guess, bring it all together, we as a society, especially, in this time, we've created a divisiveness around technology that actually can provide us tremendous value. But because of our human beingness, because we don't understand, and therefore we can't really pull up and work together based on the words that we use, I think it's ever important that we continue to share things as you just shared, because the aha moments that I just had just from those stories, right? If we had energy storage or the capability to store energy 120 years ago, right? What we see and how we use energy and what it would be something that we probably couldn't even imagine. But that's the Achilles heel. The whole grid operates on you need to produce the exact amount of energy that all of us beings are using. And because of the machinery, if you get that off tilter, it's a really bad day. Yeah. I think I made up the name tilter. So again, it goes back to where we started, the importance of using the words and really describing what we need right now. And I think one thing we lose sight of is the electric utility. When they started, they designed, when we say the utility, the people that were part of a company designed, manufactured, and employed the assets, and then they operated, maintained, and ensured the health thereof. And it wasn't until it went real big, economies of scale, it was we can offload this knowledge base to the outside. And so over the last 40 years, the utility space was kind of set of hey, we built this large grid, it does its thing, no one's questioning it, they're using energy, everything's a happy day. And then the vendors created the assets for us. But we're in a place now where I think it's time for those that understand the operation of all of those assets as a whole. There's a whole plethora of experts, and they sit within the utility space. And if we tie and ground into the physical phenomena of what electricity is and who the technical experts are, there's a more than enough for all to play a part in this transformation. And so the one thing is, how do we communicate effectively from the technical know-how to that all of the rules and tariffs and policies that have been stood up to really transform us moving forward? Yeah. So I think, just to root us back and there's people that know the answer. How can we give trust back to those experts to really bring everyone together at the table and have these great conversations to move us forward? Thanks for letting me share my thoughts.
No, it's a great point. And I know we're probably sort of getting close to the end here, but maybe I can just, build off of that a little bit and maybe offer one analogy. So, you touched on something that I think is absolutely true about, how there's so much knowledge within the industry right now. And I think both you and I agree that there's incredible advances in technology that are going to have these fundamental changes to the architecture, changes to the regulatory system as it exists. There's often a reaction that I sense, and honestly, I don't totally understand it. I do a little bit, but I think many people take that as either a personal attack or an attack on everything that the utility industry has done up to this point, as opposed to just a simple observation of where we are today, what's capable, and sort of the physics of the system. And so I hope that going forward, it will be a case, or the case where, it's not seen as some kind of threat or attack, but it is just, how do we incorporate this? If I can use one analogy, I live in Colorado. I was driving up in the mountains last weekend. It's snowing. My daughter's in the car with me, very hard to see. Came around a curve. There was a herd of elk in the road. I hit the brakes, and the brakes did exactly what they were supposed to do in today's world. Not what my father taught me to do of pumping the brakes. brakes pump themselves. So when I take that simple executive function of saying, I'm going to hit the brakes, there's a cloudburst of data and sensors and control systems that all go into action to stop me from hitting the elk. And they luckily jumped out just in time as well. So, but the same is true in the electric grid, where when we flip the switch, there is a cloudburst of data and activity and control systems. The one thing that seems clear to me is that all of that used to happen, all of that activity used to happen within the walled gardens of the utility, where it was easy to exchange information from one place to another. The control systems were all the levers were all in the control room of the utility. With the distributed energy future that's coming, I think that that's going to change a bit. It doesn't mean that, there's still going to be elk in the road. There's still going to be storms coming along. But now we have these new tools, and we need to figure out good ways that we look to the utility to be providing that kind of safety. But I'm not looking for the utility to control my car or take me out of the driver's seat. I still need to be there. But I do want to have them, and I think they will do this because that's, as you point out, what they've been doing for 100 years, figure out, how do we design and architect this system so that we can take advantage of all the capabilities that's out there, so that when we flip the switch or we hit the brakes, it does what we're looking for it to do? And that's one of the big changes that I see in the microgrid space, in the distributed energy space in general, which is just sort of opening up what used to be a very much a walled garden and making it a little bit more porous and a little bit more interactive. And one last thought that I will offer about that, it seems also clear to me that we are going to take advantage of or need sort of every bit of capital investment that's out there, whether it's consumer devices, community investment, ratepayer investment. And so we want to encourage all of it. And so all of these things playing together well seems to me really important, as opposed to thinking the utility can just do it all and we'll just put it all on the backs of ratepayers. I don't think it's realistic. I don't think it's what we want. And I think microgrids and other distributed energy resources give us a great path to be able to combine the two. In the same way that, we have a centralized set of resources that create the internet, but we all bought laptop computers and mobile devices that connect to it and interact. So that's what I hope for in the future ahead, and appreciate the chance just to come and talk about some of this with you.
Yes, this was great. And I think, this concludes our episode. And these topics we can go into wormholes. But Cameron, thank you so much for joining us and providing really this insight and the invaluable work that you're doing. Because I think what's really important for the win-win-win scenario that we're all seeking is the consortium, the benchmarking, the discussions that you've pulled together and created a really invaluable report for our listeners. So everyone should check it out. We'll put it in the listeners' notes. But with that, until next time, stay curious and informed about our ever-evolving energy landscape, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you very much.
That's a wrap for this week's episode of the Grid Mod Pod. Thanks for tuning in. We hope today's conversation got you thinking about new and creative ways to improve our power grid. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to hear new episodes. This podcast is brought to you by AEIC, the place where operations leaders come together to share knowledge and provide guidance to the electric utility industry. We'll be back with a new episode soon. Until then, keep powering on.